Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We'll be getting started with introductions in just a moment, so please make yourselves comfortable. Before we begin, a quick note about Q&A for those of you joining us live in the Zoom webinar. There will be a control in the bottom of your Zoom interface labeled Q&A. You can use this control to submit typed questions to us, which our hosts and panelists will read out and address. We would ask that you hold your questions until the designated time at the end of the lecture. Thank you for your understanding. Once again, please sit tight as we will be getting started in just a moment. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. At this time, I would like to turn things over to Professor Brian Murchison, Director of the Roger Mudd Center for Ethics and Charles S. Rowe Professor of Law at W&L, to give the introduction for tonight's guest speaker and topic.
Well, welcome to the third talk in this year's series on global ethics. The Roger Mudd Center and the Center for International Education are presenting this series. And we're very happy that this afternoon's talk is co-sponsored by Washington and Lee's Institute for Honor and by the Executive Committee of the student body. It's great to get all these groups together, and I hope we can do more of that. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Thomas H. Speedy Rice, who is Professor of Practice in the School of Law at Washington and Lee. His talk is entitled Cultural Norms and the Export of the W&L Honor System. Professor Rice is truly an international figure, much sought after lecturer on human rights, ethics, and access to legal aid. He's taught at schools in Albania, China, Hungary, Italy, Liberia, Palestine, and Ukraine, and I'm sure others. He has created student programs providing legal services in troubled spots around the world, including defense services in international tribunals. And he's been a leading figure in developing anti-corruption education. He was a Fulbright Scholar in Human Rights and Legal Education Reform at the University of Montenegro. In 2017, he received the International Anti-Corruption Excellence Award for Academic Research and Education, presented to him by the Rule of Law and Anti-Corruption Center. That center supports the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime and encourages implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption. If you were ever in the law school building, that award is on display adjacent to the moot court lobby. It's a beautiful sculpture, a steel figure in the form of a hand with an open palm, which symbolizes transparency, openness, and the values that underpin the struggle against corruption. So thank you, Professor Rice, for being with us this afternoon, and I will now turn things over to you.
Good evening, and thank you, Brian, for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you and to discuss the Washington and Lee Honor System through the lens of international experiences with law schools, principally in Eastern Europe. Before I begin, let me thank some people who've made this presentation possible. Professor Brian Murchison and Professor Mark Rush, faculty colleagues whose contributions to Washington and Lee are immeasurable, and whose friendship to me is deeply appreciated. Jeremy Weissman, Amy Jarrett, and Patrick Sheraton, who are the wizards bringing all this together, including tonight, and my research assistant on this project, Catherine Agben-Ohevi. So thank you all very much. I do start with one notice or apology before we begin. In this time of COVID and restrictions, I'm speaking from my home in San Diego, California. My wife and I have two rescue pugs who have seemed to have taken an oath on King Arthur's sword Excalibur to drive away the dragon UPS truck should it venture up my driveway. They very much like to announce that they are on their quest, so if that occurs, I apologize in advance for the noisy disruption. So a bit of background, please. While I've been teaching law since 1993, this presentation is largely based on interactions and experiences since I began international academic work over 18 years ago. The past 14 years as a faculty member at Washington and Lee School of Law. This privilege has allowed me to live and teach in a number of countries, mostly for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, but a few experiences have been anywhere from 2 months up to 18 months. My teaching has ranged across subjects depending upon the needs of the host school, but almost always interfacing with human rights, ethics, or anti-corruption in one form or another. Prior to my first international teaching adventure, my domestic law teaching experiences were probably typical. Proctored tests and exams, reviewing legal research papers for plagiarism, a few discoveries of unequivocal cheating, and the occasional issue that wound up parsing words to determine if there had been actual enforceable cheating. After all, we're teaching students to be lawyers, and if accused of cheating, we had prepared them to defend themselves with facts and interpretations of rules and codes. During all this time, I'd never encountered or experienced faculty dishonesty or corruption, even though I presume it may exist, albeit rarely. So armed with that limited experience with academic integrity, I went teaching overseas from 2002 to 2004 in Montenegro, and again in 2005, 2006 in Serbia. When I arrived at Washington and Lee in the fall of 2006, however, this was my first introduction to the Washington and Lee Honor System. I can't say what my thoughts and impressions would have been had I come to W&L with only a domestic experience. But after my teaching overseas, frankly, I was quite perplexed and definitely skeptical that such a loosely defined system with only student enforcement could possibly work. Maybe, but it was one of those things I wanted to see. For the most part, I have been proved wrong, but the reactions I continually get working to export and promote the W&L Honor System overseas feel a lot like what I was thinking and feeling when I started at W&L, but with an added complexity of cultural diversity and cultural norms. Now, what are cultural norms? It's not a perfect choice of words for what you enter in this environment. A common practices would work as another word, but it's not quite perfect either. The online psychology dictionary defines a cultural norm as a cultural regulation, moral, or guideline, which designates an approved or proper action within the framework of a particular society. Academic integrity can fall into that, but when it's not academic integrity, but academic disintegrity, maybe it's not a norm, but it certainly is a practice. So a cultural practice is more often used to define a unique or special practice of a culture, subculture, or group within a subculture. Different cultural norms and practices, especially when objective, are what make international travel and experience so interesting and rewarding. A core foundation of international experiential offerings at W&L or any school is the opportunity to experience different and varied cultures and their norms. There are endless examples that I won't bother with here, but suffice to say, each society and culture has differences which make them unique. While most of these cultural norms do not have a value judgment associated with them. Some do. But they too are often not much more than, well, we don't do it that way in the US, or in the reverse common slang, when in Rome. It's interesting, we like it. But some norms and practices go much further than a difference, and they confront and challenge our US cultural norms and our Washington and Lee cultural norms. They are not what our expectations are for the treatment of people, and they don't really fall within a category of ignoring or passively dismissing. This is especially true when the difference presents an ethical or moral dilemma. The Psychology Dictionary again frames an ethical dilemma as a situation where two moral principles are in conflict. That sounds straightforward enough, but oftentimes the situation in conflict is something that would never be tolerated in your native culture, but you're in a different culture and you're exposed to it and you have to confront it. So when you hit these ongoing practices within cultures or subcultures that are ethically or morally wrong, but have so long existed and been practiced that they become a norm and you're the visitor, what's your role? What do you do with this? You could pack your bag and leave the country, but that's defeating, doesn't solve a single problem. You could ignore it, creating a great deal of mental angst. Or you could try to find ways to address the cultural norm in a positive and constructive way to see if you can't lead conduct to something that may work for them in their culture and be acceptable in our culture. So in many given cultures, the matter that's legally, morally, or ethically wrong just may be accepted by all the people doing it. And it may be the way things are, particularly when it's giving both sides an advantage at one time or another. When you confront these issues from outside the culture, an acceptable solution can sometimes be difficult, if not impossible, to find. Some situations are just not acceptable for one to be a participant, even if just a passive participant. While it's true one culture should not impose its values on another culture, there are universal values. There are universal core experiences, things we just don't do. In some situations, though, what is ethically and morally right is not possible or practical. And what is possible or practical is not always ethically or morally right. But the issue involved has pushed you well beyond the when in Rome justification. So a couple of basic examples to illustrate this dilemma before I get to the academic ones. Both the US and country A make it illegal to bribe a police officer or for the officer to demand a bribe. Same for a magistrate. I don't think anyone at Washington and Lee or elsewhere listening to this lecture, if they get a speeding ticket in the next day or two, is going to offer a bribe to a Virginia State police officer or their police officer to avoid a speeding ticket. We just don't do it. It's also very unlikely the officer would take it. And very likely you would be in a lot more trouble than just the speeding ticket. You might be arrested and have to appear before a magistrate. On top of that, the Virginia State Patrol officer is also very unlikely to demand a bribe. It does happen, but it's really rare. However, now you're in country A. The car you're riding in gets pulled over for speeding. You don't have to be speeding, it just gets pulled over for it. Your local colleague asks you for $20 US to pay off the officer, or the officer will take both of you to the local magistrate to pay the speeding ticket, which at that moment will become $200. So particularly when a foreigner is involved that they feel would have the ability to pay it. But paying a bribe is wrong, so you refuse. Your friend then quickly explains that if the magistrate sees an American coming, he or she will take a break and leave the bench. You'll both have to sit in jail till you then either pay the bailiff a bribe to go get the magistrate or until they get tired of waiting. Either way, your schedule for that day is shot, it's gone, and it's replaced with a mountain of anxiety. While it's just as illegal in country A as it is in Virginia, in reality in country A, you have no recourse as everyone accepts the practice as just the way it is. After this happens to you once, you realize it's to everyone's advantage to just pay the 20 bucks up front, no matter how much it's offensive or how much you feel you're compromising your ethics. Similarly, you and a group of 6 arrive at Country B's airport late at night. And I'm not making this up, these have happened to me. And a long way from the town you need to get to. You pre-arrange for a van service to take all of you and your luggage to the hotel, as the airport generally doesn't have taxis at that hour. On this trip, by the time all the bags are delivered and you're the last ones to get to customs. The customs agent says you can avoid customs inspection if you pay him 50 bucks. You look, it's bad enough to be extorted for a bribe, but now it's in front of your students in an anti-corruption course. Not a good spot to be in. So you have a principal involved, and even though it's close to midnight, you stand your ground and refuse. 90 minutes, 2 hours later, all the bags have been thoroughly searched. You go out to your van, which you're lucky is still there, and the driver tells you it's an additional $100 due to the long wait. You protest, but the driver says either get another ride, there are none, or pay the waiting fee. And then he adds for good measure, and you should have paid the custom official as he has a family to feed. Now, they're all in on it, and there's no one to complain to, especially if you plan to return in the future. So these kinds of dilemmas are one thing to one set of people and another thing to you. So now how does this play out in academics? Fortunately, this issue has been studied a great deal around the world, so you don't have to just rely on my personal experiences. It's also important to note that academic corruption is not unilateral. Professors extort students, and in any given case, a student will offer a bribe to a professor. A master's or PhD thesis can be heavily plagiarized. Money will change hands to ignore the plagiarism. And again, later it'll change hands to have the paper removed from public view as soon as the degree is awarded, so it no longer exists to be researched or checked. Add to this cheating on exams or tests by any number of creative means. Once the practice becomes possible and ignored or accepted, it expands exponentially, and the moral and ethical issues become, at best, a passing thought. You might not see any of this on a short visit, but as a visiting professor or after some regular trips, these practices start to become evident, or your friendship with students at the school start to have conversations that leave you deeply troubled. A 2015 study in Russia, funded by the European Union, came to some startling conclusions by our standards, and it matches some of my experiences, so it's not unique to Russia. Academic corruption, and the writer says, academic corruption in Russia is extensively spread. It is not an isolated phenomenon. Rather, academic corruption is tightly embedded into the general corruption in society, in politics, business, and everyday life. This paper illustrates some common types of cheating or corruption, as well as the motives involved with the actors applying, accepting, ignoring, or pretending to ignore the activities. Now, the researcher, the writer of the report, poses a question and then answers it herself on why corruption in higher education is so prevalent. And she demonstrates it's because both sides benefit. The improper dependence of all involved make this possible. Compared to people without a university education, graduates have a much better chance on the job market at a higher wage. University lecturers who had to bribe their way through school and now are chafing under a low salary, they expect bribes in order to return on the investment they had to make to get their own studies. They both win in it. The researcher goes on to note, during their studies, young people complete their socialization by acquiring, among other things, more techniques for corrupt behavior and a tolerance for corruption. Some examples. From a male third-year student, my friend and I did not pass the exam, and the lecturer himself gave a hint to us that, well, we can pay a sponsorship fee, and the problem was solved. From a female third-year student, I had to leave urgently, and I didn't have as much time to prepare for the exam as expected. So I went to the lecturer and explained. Without a word, he wrote a number on a piece of paper and I agreed. I passed my exam. In another country, this exchange takes place easily in many other places. A local professor and a researcher can typically be meeting in an office. But in many of the overseas situations, in fact, virtually all of them, the meetings are held behind closed doors and the only windows are to the outside. So no one knows what's going on in that office. And sitting there talking to the professor, you hear a knock at the door. And the professor says, come in, and a person opens the door and then startled looks at you and then stares at the professor. And the professor says, it's okay, he's a friend of mine. And the individual then takes an envelope, gives it to the professor puts it in the drawer. Strange, but not impossible. A few minutes later, another knock, different individual, same reaction, another envelope in the drawer. A little while later, knock again, third individual, same reaction, he's a friend of mine, envelope in the drawer. And at that point, you say to the professor, what's going on? What is this all about? It's kind of strange. He says, oh, don't worry. Those are the parents of my students. They're just coming to say hello. So you sit there and you wonder to yourself, what actually are you sitting in and what should you do about it? So you go to a couple other faculty people you've gotten to know and you ask them about this event. And they say, oh, well, we've heard of such things, but we don't do that. So later, as you get to know your students you're teaching, you decide to take some of them out for pizza. And in the course of the conversation, you ask them, you explain this story, and you say, what was going on? And they laugh and chuckle with great glee, and they say, oh, it works like this. You go in and you take your oral exam, and the professor gives you a 7, but you really want a 9 or a 10. So you ask the professor, can't you do better? And the professor says, I don't think you studied enough, and your father needs to come see me so we can straighten this out. That's the code. Father comes and sees the professor, does what he does. Kid comes back, takes the exam again because they can retake them. Now the kid only gets an 8. And he says, Professor, my father came to see you. And the professor says, oh, yes, but he didn't stay long enough. And the students explained to me that was the code. It wasn't enough money. So then, completely inadvertently, listening to this, I said, well, if some professors are doing that for money, are some of them exploiting students for sex? Conversation stopped dead, not a word. It went from kind of a joke, kind of haha, everyone's in on it, to dead silence. And then they decided to excuse themselves and leave the room. There was no talking about that. The problem is, what can you do about it? You're a guest in the school, you're there, you come up with ways to do it. In that time, before W&L, the solution was to start a course on ethics, not legal ethics, ethics as a rule. And as a project in the class, the school let me have the students and some visitors draft a code of conduct for the university. They didn't have one. That took 2 more years before it was adopted. But those are the kinds of solutions you have to come up with because you can't stomp your foot, they'll just ask you to leave. You can't keep your mouth shut because then you'll go to bed with anxiety every night going, what do I do about this? It's a dilemma and it's not uncommon. In a 2017 published study entitled Ukraine, Endemic Higher Education Corruption, the researchers found the following from a survey of 600 students at public universities. 47.8% of students have experience with bribing. 95.4% of the students admit that they cheat during an exam or test. 92.8% write papers by copying and pasting without acknowledging their source. 64.2% download papers from the internet and submit them as their own. 40% purchase papers from ghostwriters, and 35.7% ask faculty for preferential treatment. And it's not unique to Eastern Europe. A study in Mexico recently at our medical schools reported that 57% of fourth-year medical students admitted to making unofficial payments at the school to pass an exam. These are medical students, they're gonna be your doctor. Is it learned conduct though? Is it something they develop over time? The same study found only 3% of first-year students reported making a payment. So yes, it seems to be learned conduct. So now you're in these dilemmas overseas, but you've encountered, you're in the W&L Honor System. It's giving you a tool because codes of conduct are just that, they're codes. And particularly in former authoritarian countries, they have mountains of codes. Codes to people in authoritarian countries are just things to work around. They're just a problem to solve. They're not a direction to follow. So, and I mean that in a broad sort of sense, but there's so many codes, they really just sort of figure out, I've got to follow my experiences and deal with it later. So my experiences and academic research compelled the essential question. Confronted with these issues of academic dishonesty, how do you address it? And can the W&L Honor System be part of the solution? Most times the opportunity to introduce and discuss the W&L Honor System is a single event. The Honor System has been part of presentations at numerous schools, somewhere between 12 and 15 countries when I've been provided the opportunity. However, in Ukraine, we've been fortunate to have multiple opportunities to present the honor system. And in using the W&L Honor System to discuss academic integrity with local professors, administrators, students, we have used a variety of means. We have participated in academic workshops, small group meetings. We've used W&L students when they've traveled with me to present the honor system to their Ukrainian student groups. We've had a group of Ukrainian faculty and administrators visit W&L to discuss the honor system. And we've even had the W&L White Book translated into Ukrainian so that they have it for easier understanding. What we're trying to do is bridge the gap. And to help bridge this gap between what you experience there and what you think is a system of better academic integrity, we've also collected an extensive copy of codes of conduct, which are more familiar to academics, both in the US and in a code-based legal system such as Ukraine. Each time we make a little progress, but mostly we are met with fascination and skepticism, not unlike my first reaction to the W&L Honor System. They're looking at you like, you want the students to do what? You saw the statistics on Ukraine, how many are bribing and how many are confessed to cheating on exam. So in truth, our current honor system is just too big a leap or a transition under the existing cultural practice. But because of its uniqueness, because of the really interesting power we've delegated to students and the simplicity of it, it's a great way to encourage discussion on academic ethics and integrity that a stack of detailed codes just can't match. It's a powerful tool to open the door and have the conversation. At the start with our first law school, we did have to concede on a key issue. There's such a history of corruption and cheating that students do not trust professors or administrators to be fair and honest in dealing with them. And professors and administrators don't trust the students. It's almost a cat and mouse game of the students and the professors and what can be gotten away with. To make any progress, the first thing you have to do is get all of them willing to sit at the same table and have an honest discussion about the situation and what's wrong with it. To address this, we promote an honor system or a code of conduct that has application to all parties. So unlike the student-run honor system at W&L, we take the honor system and we expand it out to say, everyone has to live under this. If you make it just an honor system directed toward the students, it'll just be another rule, another game, another something they have to work around. So you get them engaged and you get all the other faculty. So faculty are held accountable too. And that's the one question I get the most is, well, who monitors the faculty at W&L? And I say, well, it's not under the honor system, but we do try to live by it. And mainly federal and state employment law takes care of the rest. But we had to get that. So we had to promote this with students at an equal seat to the table with faculty and administrators. But the honor system was an essential tool to get faculty and administrators to open up to the idea to trusting students. When you explain the amount of trust we give to our students and you ask them why can't they give some trust to their students, they start to come around and say, well, we can give them some. If you can do this at W&L, then you convince them that they can certainly do half of that at their school. Very powerful tool. At the same time, for this school, we started a Washington and Lee student Facebook group in partnership with the students at the Ukrainian Law School to promote student-to-student discussions on an honor system and how it should work. It took almost a year of various meetings and drafting reviews, but the law school produced its first unified code covering administrators, faculty, students, and staff, which was their own, written by them. They had ownership, titled Moral and Ethical Minimums for the Community of the Law School. This was in December of 2015. Now, while it's far more typical of a university code of conduct, the Washington Lee Honor System was key to the equal student participation in it. Following this success, we've used each opportunity at various law schools in Ukraine to promote the W&L Honor System. Pretty confident we're not going to see an immediate duplication. We set our goal on promoting written, clear, enforceable codes of conduct, drafted and implemented with students as equal partners to the rest of the university. Each school was receptive. Each had variations, but in each there was some progress toward a more ethical academic environment with student participation. Two unrelated events occurred which boosted the discussion and interest in the W&L Honor System as we presented it. First, the Ukrainian Ministry of Education began encouraging higher education institutions in Ukraine to adopt codes of conduct under the Law on Higher Education, Article 42, Academic Integrity. Second was actually the publication of Washington and Lee's report on the Commission of Institutional History and Community at Washington and Lee. That was in May of 2018. In this report, there's a discussion of the W&L Honor System and its development as researched by Professor John Gunn in 2003 and 4. It's an outstanding piece of work for digging back into historical records. What was extremely helpful in promoting the honor system from Professor Gunn's research was its evolution to its present form. The W&L Honor System did not begin in its present form, and its history bridged the gap between what was conceivable in Ukraine and today's W&L student-run system. Of importance was Professor Gunn's research that the W&L Honor System in its early years had an extensive set of student regulations, which were reduced over time and then eventually eliminated, with the guiding principle being the sole statement of the expectation of community expectations. Likewise, our honor system did not start out as a student-run system. Professor Gunn writes, in the beginning, sometime in the mid-1840s, the honor system appears to have been administered entirely by the faculty. During President Lee's administration, or in any case after 1857-58 academic year, primary responsibility of the system was placed upon the students, but appeals were still to the faculty. After 1867, but prior to 1905, exclusive responsibility for the honor system passed to the student body, and in 1905, it was placed in the newly formed executive committee of the university, student committee. So that path and that transition, particularly the time it took, was a key to getting Ukrainian administrators and faculty to think, well, wait, we can start. We can take these steps that worked, even though it was 150, 200 years ago, we can take these steps and we can have a plan. We might want to be at a full student-run honor system in 20 years, but now we know if you follow a plan, you can get there. So these historical revelations showed a pathway for other higher institutions to reach or at least think about getting to a Washington Lee honor system. It also set up a process where the code is not just adopted and then sits on a shelf, which is all too often a failing. To achieve the goal of a W&L student-run honor system, the university had to commit itself to ongoing assessments and reviews, with students having a focus on achieving greater and greater autonomy for their ethical behavior as they demonstrated the responsibility to govern themselves. We now had actual proof that that's how it worked. That's how we got to where we are. In 2018-19, we laid out this approach in a series of workshops and a final written report to a law faculty in Ukraine. The law faculty approved the report and has forwarded it to the University Faculty Senate for their consideration. Similarly, at another law faculty in Ukraine, they were persuaded to create an ethical commission with equal student representation along with faculty and administrators, and to have it operate independent of administrative control. It is not under the control of the rector of the university. This week in meetings with the law school, they reported that after more than a year in operation, the commission is functioning well and has acted to improve lecturer and professor conduct through education and effective enforcement, as well as students working on issues of student cheating. So that's where you see the success in the honor code. You know, it's a complicated thing to just get from A to W&L, but we have a path, and we have a very unique and successful system that gives us a way to talk about that path. But every coin has two sides, doesn't it? So how has the international reaction to the W&L honor code helped inform us about our honor code? The questions and challenges that we get from academics and professors and students overseas foster reflection and research on our part to some very basic questions. When we promote the W&L honor system, we're promoting a shared belief, or at least a shared belief of the majority of the W&L community. But do we actually have any way to substantiate what we're saying? Have we ever empirically studied the honor code? We get asked that question. Where's your data? And I don't know of any, to be frank with you. I'm not sure we have actually tried an actual empirical study with students and alumni to really test what the honor code, how it functioned and what it did. Some of the more challenging questions are also, you have a student executive committee and occasional hearings on student cheating or dishonorable conduct. But have you ever surveyed the graduates? Do you have the data to know it actually works versus a case or two makes you feel good about it? Good question. America is a very diverse country. So how does the honor system account for the beliefs and current concerns of students in the minority, or in other words, how do you combat inherent bias? Social media has literally changed everything. How do you define and maintain honor in today's social media environment? I don't have the answer to these questions, but I get them, and they're quite fascinating. Cheating is usually easy to understand, but what exactly is honor, and how do you enforce it equitably? And the answer that it's a community standard isn't sufficient, because they want something to grab onto, because they don't yet have the community for the standard. So there is some research at other schools that give us some insights into the answer to these questions, at least in the broad sense of human nature at universities. Contextual factors such as student perception play a large role in issues of academic dishonesty. If students perceive that social norms among peers allow cheating, a culture of cheating is most likely to develop. That's a study from the US, but we know it's true overseas. In a comparison between a school that had honor codes, schools that had honor codes and schools without honor codes, the authors of one study, Sledge and Pringle, observed divergent results when it came to the level of respect students had for their instructor. In a significant margin, students who went to a school with an honor code viewed their instructors more favorably. That's a good start, and that's where we are. But in a study by Professor Bloomfield to establish what links individual students have to the culture of the university, he determined that the vital link is the presence of a value-driven system within the school. Whether an honor code, whether common academic issues such as academic dishonesty, whether they lead to the overall culture is determined by several factors. These factors include student perception of their peers. student perceptions of how the faculty interpret the rules, and students' perception of the severity of the punishment. Professor Bloomberg also found a positive effect when the school's honor code explicitly expresses values of kindness, compassion, and friendship, not merely defining prohibited behavior. And lastly, there was concern for the limited life experience of student councils and the fact that many of the decisions are not transparent. Issues that are particularly sensitive and involve marginalized populations may be difficult for students with little life experience or interaction and knowledge of the population to judge appropriately. There's some food for thought there. It certainly would suggest some ways we could maybe take another look at our honor system. Now, we have an example. The honor system at the University of Virginia, just up the road from you there, serves as one of the best documented examples of how a lack of transparency in an honor system may facilitate bias. Anna Bobrow examined some of these issues in the June 2020 Law Review article entitled Restoring Honor, Ending Racial Disparities in University Honor Systems. It's a good read. I recommend it to all of you. In this article, she examines a test case where the University of Virginia Law School had to confront the issue of racial biases due to a controversial case that animated the campus. A subsequent UVA report compared the percentage of students of various racial groups and reported percentages of honor council investigations. The results revealed that despite students of color composing a minority of the student body, they were overrepresented in honor council examinations and processes. For example, in 1987 to 1989, Black students made up at least 41% of all students dismissed from UVA, but they were only 9% of the UVA student body. In 2010 to 2016, Black students made up at least 12% of sanctioned students, but they were only 6% of the university population. Bobrow finds one reason for this is called spotlighting, which is a term to refer to the phenomenon in which minorities are disproportionately selected because they are more identifiable within the campus community. Now, these are questions that need an answer, that we should be able to answer at W&L because we get that question about our honor code. Since we don't define it, we make it a community standard. People overseas, when they get into it, want to know, how do we deal with that? What is it we do to take steps to protect that? As for the effectiveness of W&L's honor code, we don't have empirical data, but we do have some very interesting studies and experiments by Dr. Dan Arle, who is the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics at Duke University and a founding member of the Center for Advanced Hindsight. His work on cheating and honor codes is sobering, but really enlightening. Dr. Arle and his partners designed a test called the matrix test. It's a bunch of math problems and the like, but the critical part of the test is the test taker gets paid for the number of right answers under a timed condition. To determine cheating, the test taker at the end of the exam is told to shred their test, report the correct number of answers to the student intern for payment. However, the test, while it sounds like it's being shredded, is not being shredded. So the test goes in, they look, they score it real quick, then they listen to the answer the person gives, and are they telling the truth or are they cheating to get some more money? Standardized test, done over and over. They run it in a substantial number of dual sessions where half the people are asked to recall the 10 commandments before taking the test. And the other half are asked to recall 10 books they had read. They're in separate rooms, same time. Does the honor code make a difference? The people asked to recall the 10 commandments just before taking the test have almost zero cheating, almost zero. And the ones who were asked to recall 10 books had an expected almost 35% degree of cheating in terms of claiming excess money. They've run this over and over. The number stays consistent for the most part. So then he had the question, do honor codes make a difference? So he had a visiting professor time at MIT with another class he taught at Yale. And he decided to run the experiment on MIT and Yale students. Same thing, half the students are in one room, half the students are in another, same test. With half the students, he reads the statement, I understand this experiment falls under the guidelines of the MIT and Yale Honor Code, and the students have to sign the top of the paper before they take the test. The other students were not asked to sign an honor code, the honor code. But the MIT and Yale students who signed this statement did not cheat. And that's despite the fact that neither university has an honor code. They don't have one. They made it up. So it kind of tells you something about honor codes, honor systems, and where you need to place the affirmation of the honor code. Does it matter if you do have an honor code? That was his next big question. So where they went to Princeton University. Princeton University has a rigorous honor system that's been around since 1893. Incoming freshmen receive a copy of the Honor Code Constitution and a letter from the Honor Committee about the honor system, which they must sign before they can matriculate. They also attend mandatory talks about the importance of the Honor Code during their first week of school. Following the lectures, the incoming Princetonians further discuss the system with their dorm advisor groups. And if that's not enough, one of the campus musical groups, the Triangle Club, performs its honor code song for the incoming class. For the rest of their time at Princeton, students are repeatedly reminded of the honor code. They sign an honor code at the end of every paper they submit. This paper represents my own work in accordance with university regulations. They sign another pledge at the end of every exam, test, or quiz. I pledge on my honor that I have not violated the honor code during this examination. And they receive biennial reminder emails from the honor committee. Does it sound familiar? It does to me. To see if Princeton's crash course on morality and ethics has a long-term effect, Professor Arley waited 2 weeks after the freshmen finished their ethical training before trying to tempt them to cheat, giving them the exact same test and opportunity as MIT and Yale students, of course, neither of which have an honor code. Were the Princeton students, still relatively fresh from their immersion in the honor code, more honest when they completed the matrix task? Sadly, they were not. Dr. Arley found that when the Princeton students were asked to sign honor code before the test, they did not cheat at all. However, when they were not asked to sign the honor code till after the test, they cheated just as much as their counterparts at MIT and Yale. It seems that the crash course, the issues on morality, the existence of the honor code just didn't have a lasting effect on the moral fiber of Princetonians. Now, he points out these results are depressing and promising. And it's one issue I take with the W&L Honor Code that we really need to consider. Should we have our students sign the code, the pledge, before they take a test? Should we have them put it at the start of every paper before they write it? It seems to be a very simple thing to do that has a very positive effect. I recommend his book to you. It's called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. And it's got a lot of studies in it that are quite humorous. For example, in some of the tests, he asked people to write down the 10 commandments. And he said, interestingly, no one could remember the 10 commandments, and they remembered quite a few that aren't in there. So it's an entertaining read, but it's also a great deal of helpful data. So in conclusion, I'd like to tell you that the honor code at W&L, how it runs, how it operates, is an effective tool overseas, and particularly in environments that have become highly infected with mutual corrupt behavior in an academic environment. But you can't translate it one-to-one. It's just too big a bridge. But the data we have on it gets us there, helps us with schools understand why it works and why it's important. And interestingly, they admire the fact that our students run it completely. They see that as a positive and admirable thing. They just don't see how they can get there till we've laid out a path, as Professor Gunn's research has shown us. But likewise, my working and my dealings with it have indicated that we probably have some good and healthy work to do in studying and looking again at our honor system. I'm not proposing changing it. But I am proposing we take a new look at it with regard to social media, with regard to bias and harassment, with regard to, how do groups work? We're becoming a very polarized, a very siloed community in groups. That all has to be affecting our honor code. And as we continue to work with it and export it and get questions from overseas, I look forward to when I can answer these questions directly about W&L, as opposed to having the anecdotal stories I have or the research from other schools. So thank you all very much. I hope I haven't worn you out or made things too boring. And there's a question and answer button at the bottom of the screen. They'd like you to click and type a question. And the moderators will read the questions and we'll try to make up an answer for them. Thank you.
Thanks, Speedy. Hi all, this is Mark Rush. I am going to be joined by Jeremy Weissman, and we will be reading off and moderating the questions for Speedy. We've got a couple already in the queue, so I will mention I'll go with the first one here. The question asks, when you were in the Ukraine and you helped establish the beginnings of the honor system, the honor code there with the students and faculty, do you think you changed the sense of right and wrong, or did you simply change the incentive structure?
Well, I don't know what we changed the incentive structure to. I haven't run into that. Here's what I think. I think the students don't like it generally, because if it was just simply paying a little bit of money to get a better grade, I'm not sure they'd care. But it never stops there. The issues of exploitation are greater and above that. I think a lot of faculty members, everyone's doing it, so okay, I'm not going to fight it. What they are extremely sensitive to is the embedded, extensive corruption in the country of Ukraine and in the government of Ukraine. They see that harming them. They know that's damaging to them. They know their country has suffered from corruption. There's no disputing that with the Ukrainians. And they are right up front talking about it. So when you approach them about corruption at their level, they're the kind of folks who say, yes, if I'm going to solve corruption in Ukraine, I better start here at home. I better start here today. We often paraphrase an Eleanor Roosevelt quote. When asked where human rights started, Eleanor Roosevelt said, it starts at home. It starts at the kitchen table. It starts with every father, mother, and child at their kitchen table talking about right and wrong. And we use that, we paraphrase that to talk about corruption. Where do you start to defeat corruption? It starts at home. It starts where you have an effect on it. So yeah, I think we are changing the paradigm. If there's a different incentive structure, it's actually a very good question. It's probably gonna make me much more aware to try to see if something isn't coming from that. Thank you.
All right, hi, I'm Jeremy Weissman. I'll take the next question. So the introduction of the student-run independence of W&L's honor system certainly seems like a logical means of combating corruption in any school. However, is there any pushback regarding the single sanction requirement of the honor system in schools that are implementing W&L's system?
Yeah, there's a lot of pushback on that. And in fact, it's the one issue on the single sanction I've never really tried to promote. But there's more reasons for it than just pushback. We're a private school, and a student subjected to the single sanction punishment at Washington Lee has limited resources. In countries that have come out of communism, post-Soviet countries like Ukraine, that have then opened up their court system, opened up their legal system to more fluid and democratic processes, a school dismissing a student as a single sanction, at least for the time being, would get sued for damages. The professor would get sued for defamation. It would be an ordeal of litigation. Then this is where the corruption in the country comes in. You don't know that the person you threw out isn't going to be in a position to perhaps know the judge, or, you know, it's got a lot of unknowns to it. So we've really just kind of stayed away from, we tell them about the single sanction and they're very sort of like, whoa, that's a lot. But we don't think it's going to work during a transition period just yet. It may work to get there in the future when the culture of integrity is much higher, but it's going to be difficult to make that work now. So we really don't push the single sanction.
Thanks, Speedy. Next question, just a general one. Can you discuss a bit more? You mentioned the implications of social media that it may have on the honor system. Can you discuss that a little bit, at least with regards to W&L?
Yes. We all have conversations with our students. We all chat, we have emails, things come up. And it's interesting that students, particularly if they feel they're in a vulnerable group, fear that the honor system is not as airtight as we think it is or want it to be. And that if it does leak, as we see in government regularly now, the result is a barrage of hateful and threatening social media. So one area I think it definitely deters is if a person is in a disadvantage or minority group or some group that they feel less powerful at W&L, and they see folks that they would consider as part of an in-powerful group cheating, they're far less likely to turn it in, far less likely, because they see things happening down the road that are personally threatening to them and destabilizing to them. And in truth, I don't know why they wouldn't. Look what we see happening in our federal government with one leak after another, and then people getting death threats and having to hire security and guards. It's a troubling time we're in, and social media has exacerbated a lot of bad conduct. Let's put it that way. Does good things too, but it certainly has opened the door to a lot of bad conduct. And there's a reason to be afraid of it.
So this next question is, have you run into any cases of threats being used instead of bribery? Or is it exclusively or almost exclusively an issue of bribery in terms of the corruption you've come across?
Are you talking about it, I assume at the universities, at the law schools? Certainly getting a failing grade is a threat. And so understand that it's changing now. We've been really part of helping get them changed to written exams or to exams that are anonymous. But when we started on this task, virtually all of the examinations were oral. They were in person. They were often in the professor's office behind a closed door. The students carry around with them what they call the index. It has all their grades in it. So when you go to take the exam, you have to hand your index to the professor, who opens it up and sees your photograph, make sure it's you, because he's going to say, you better prove to me you're who you are. But at the same time, the professor also sees all your grades. So the common expression in Ukraine and other countries like that are, the first year you work for the index. After that, the index works for you. So if you do well in your first year and get a lot of 10s by one way or another, professors are going to see those, and you're increasingly going to be getting higher grades. So that first year is very stressful, in particular with the index system. And I can't say I recall where a student has been threatened in terms of physical harm. I haven't really run into that, but I certainly have run into students being threatened with failing or being kicked out of school for one reason or another. And oftentimes it's in a very exploitive way.
So we're going to jump around a bit here. Question comes in, what sort of questions should we pose to the student body, or what kind of data do you think needs to be collected to better explain or at least begin to study the honor system here at W&L?
Well, I think I would really start with surveys and have them be anonymous, have anonymous surveys, and be careful about wording the questions to try to figure out what can be improved. It's easy enough to do a survey that winds up with everyone saying, oh, what a great job we're doing. But you want a survey that looks for where there are some weaknesses. You want a survey that speaks to the whole community. And I'd start with gathering that kind of data first. And once I had that data and it showed me where maybe there's areas of concern and where there aren't, then I would explore some interviews and direct conversations with people who I would hope could flush out that data with experience or experiential stories of their time at W&L. And I think that would be the way to do it. It's pretty, it's a not unstandard way for good studies to be done.
So this next question is, have schools in the Ukraine made the effort to become accredited in the past years, or are law schools still lacking a formal accreditation system? And how does this further impact the ethical effort to combat corruption?
Well, actually, for the last 7 years, we've been working on the accreditation process. We started in 2014, 13 or 14, with doing what is called the External Independent Law School Assessment. And we modeled it somewhat after an ABA accreditation program. We did one a year for 4 years, wrote an extensive report, and provided those to the Ministry of Education in Ukraine. They've taken that and distributed the survey, the assessment survey, to the rest of the law schools in Ukraine, asking them to conduct either an internal assessment or to use members of the community to conduct an external assessment. Now we're in a process of going back to the original 4 schools and reviewing, now that 5 years has passed and we will do them going forward with the schools, what did the assessment bring to them? What did they do with that assessment? How did it help them? In the meantime, the Ministry of Education and many of the leading academics in Ukraine have made several trips to the US to visit with the ABA and the AALS to understand the accreditation process. And they're they're implementing an accreditation process in Ukraine, not unlike, but tailored to their needs, but basically an accreditation process of that nature.
Next up, a different spin. It's pointed out the adjudicative power in examining facts of cases does rest with the executive committee here at W&L, but the honor system depends on the entire community as it chooses, or its members chooses what and what not to report. And so the question asks, do you have any ideas for how best to promote this idea to strengthen the sense of community at W&L? I suppose this would also extend to any other university you work with. How do you plant the seeds of the whole community to begin to uphold and enforce an honor system?
Well, we get some hints of it in the research that I reviewed and read. And one is there should be some ways to define and give examples of what we expect, what our honor system is, through positive examples. Generally we expect everyone to be an honorable person and not to lie, cheat, or steal. But what about being a respectful person in the context of language? There are ways we can start to promote the honor system as a really sort of positive thing, more so than I see today. And if you think it's working and you're not quite paying the attention to it you should, it tends to fall to a lower common denominator, which is the lying, cheating, and stealing. And I would do a survey of students on campus first to start asking them, what conduct do they think should be included in honorable conduct? I would actually not rely on a community standard that is whatever. I'd rely on a community standard that survives some polling, some issues, choices of questions. Is a racial slur dishonorable? Is Is a sexual assault dishonorable? It's certainly a criminal act, but is it dishonorable? And maybe you can't do some of these things because of intervening state and federal laws, but that can be worked out. So I think really the place I'd start is with current students. Give them an online poll and give them a list of questions in an open box to say what conduct should be included in the honor code, what or at least viewed as either emphasizing and highlighting the great value of the honor system, or as bringing disrespect or diminishing it. That's not really being talked about or included.
Well, thank you. We don't have any more questions about topics that haven't already been addressed, so I'm going to give it back to Professor Murchison now to take us out.
Thanks, Jeremy. Speedy, I just want to say thank you for giving us an incredibly enlightening lecture. We really appreciate your being part of this whole series on global ethics, and you've given us a real unique part in that whole overarching topic for this year. So thank you very much. And we want to just say how much we appreciate your being part of it.
Well, thank you very much for having me and giving me this opportunity. I greatly appreciate it.
Great. And have a good evening.
Thanks. Thank you.